So good afternoon. I want to welcome everybody to today's program, which is titled Uncovering Untraditional Career Paths Within Architecture. And my name is Lynn Burke, and I am the Senior Co-op Coordinator in the School of Architecture at Northeastern University. I work with both undergraduate and graduate students in the realm of cooperative education. And in a moment, we will be hearing from an incredible group of panelists with very varied career paths within the architecture field. I would say the purpose of today's program is to highlight that a foundation in architecture builds critical thinking skills, which really can be applicable across many fields and can lead to numerous career paths, as you will see from some of our panelists today. So some quick programming notes. If you could keep yourself muted, that would be ideal. And I will be monitoring the chat. So if you have questions, please ask them and we can hopefully, with time permitting, get to those at the end. So without further ado, I will ask the panelists to introduce themselves and lead right into answering the first question, which is, when did that aha moment happen for you? When you realized that perhaps a traditional architecture career wasn't exactly the right fit. So we'll start with Amy.
Thank you, Lynn. My name is Amy Liedem, and I'm a licensed architect, but I work as a sustainability consultant at Atelier 10 in San Francisco. I graduated with a BSc from Northeastern in 2007. And I would say that I actually did not necessarily have one distinct aha moment. My kind of passion and interest in sustainability was sparked by the environmental systems class in our fourth year at Northeastern. And then my passion kind of slowly grew as I worked in architecture. So I did work as an architect or as a designer for many years and went to graduate school to earn my MArch in architecture as well before making the switch to sustainability consulting about 5 years ago. So for me, it wasn't one distinct aha moment, but it was throughout my experience working in the architecture field that I kind of slowly realized that I wanted to switch gears.
Great. Ernst, why don't you go next?
Hey everyone, I'm Ernst Louis, 2008, class of 2008, architecture. I actually then took that, went into real estate development. I'm currently a senior project manager with Leggett McCall here in Boston. I guess my aha moment actually was co-op, thank you, Lynn, from my sophomore year, where I did a co-op, I believe, for the MBTA at that point in time, and realized for myself that as much as I love architecture, project management and real estate development was probably something more I wanted to get into, just for the sake of being able to be involved from the process from start to finish. And I think, to Lynn's point earlier, architecture in terms of the critical thinking and just the attention to detail definitely helps and caters to that role. So much that if you actually reach out to a lot of developers, you tend to see civil engineers, architects, as well as other disciplines within that realm. So again, thanks, Lynn, and the co-op program for that piece. And it's my story for right now.
Excellent. And why don't we go to Barrett?
Hello, my name is Barrett. I am a BArch class of 2010, and I have my master's in architecture from Northeastern as well from 2011. I am currently a lighting designer at Canon Design in Boston. So I kind of, honestly, the economy kind of forced me into what I do now in a great way. It worked out for me, but I graduated in 2011 when there were next to no jobs. My father's actually a lighting designer, and I always told him I wanted to be an architect, but I moved home and started working for him when there was not a lot of jobs available, and then ended up moving over to HLB lighting and getting a full-time position there shortly after that. So I kind of fell into lighting, and it was the best thing that ever happened for me. I absolutely love what I do, and I'm working with architects every day. I'm currently in an AE firm, so we have architecture and engineering in the same firm, and we're able to work with each other every single day. So I'm still kind of getting that architecture exposure, but certainly focusing my efforts on lighting. So it's just kind of another side of the whole architecture process that we get to be a part of. And my architecture background absolutely helps in the simple understanding of, you know, what projects I'm working on. I don't think if I didn't have an architectural background and understand the drawings and the construction process so well, that I don't know if I'd be able to do my job as well as I am able to do now with that skill set. So that's my tale.
Excellent. And last but not least, Nawaz.
Hey, yeah, I'm Nawaz Kamtawala. I'm a senior UX designer at Verily, which is Google's life sciences moonshot. And I graduated with the BSc in 2009 and the MArch in 2010 from Northeastern. And after graduating, I actually did practice within architecture for about 5 years. And then I joined Oracle as a UX designer. That's kind of when I made a full-time pivot into UX. And then since then, I've been at Google for the past 2 years. And I think similarly, it was kind of a number of things that throughout the course of, you know, college and even professional work that I started to kind of gravitate towards UX. And I think definitely co-op was one of the first ones that allowed me to kind of get a sense of what architecture practice in real life looks like and the business of architecture. And then coupled that with some of the graduate study courses, specifically around case studies in the creative process and the process of design, really opened me up into just the general creative process, which I really, really enjoy. And UX definitely is kind of at the intersection of that, you know, understanding user needs and behaviors, understanding business objectives, understanding technical feasibility, which I'm sure everyone here is also very aware of in the architecture sense, and kind of putting that into practice for digital experiences where it is a little bit more in terms of the tighter feedback loop, more closely having the learning process and tighter iterations there. And that's kind of where I gravitate towards and have been there for the past 5 years.
That's great. Thank you. And this, you know, it seems like some of you may have actually answered sort of the next question, but when you look back at your architecture education, did you feel like it prepared you, encouraged you, or maybe even discouraged you from your career path that you ended up in? And I don't know who wants to start. Maybe Ernst, do you want to comment on?
Yeah, sure. I think it's a little bit of column A, column B. I think it absolutely encouraged. And I think, again, so just kind of quickly going through the path, whether it was at BTA, then working at the Massachusetts Port Authority, and then working in a global real estate department, and working for Boston Properties, and now at Leggett, it's helped a ton because there's been architects along the route. So there are people there within that realm and in that field that absolutely understand and go through what you're learning, or a lot of the students are learning or have learned in some of that. Understanding how to read plans, like Barrett mentioned, understanding how to be able to comprehend and be able to communicate what you're seeing to those who aren't familiar with those plans. It's helped a lot. I think in terms of where it potentially holds back, I don't know if it's a Northeastern or a co-op thing that's really done it. I think it's more a matter of when you're in that environment, in your atmosphere, it's almost everyone's kind of in the tunnel vision of architect or bust, right? It's more, this is what we do, this is what the realm is supposed to be. And, you know, I think you had a slide that put out, sometimes it's a little bit, you know, more courageous on your part just to kind of step outside of just that thinking and then understand that there are a bunch of other ways you can implement what you've learned there. So I think it's a little bit of column A, column B for me at least.
Right. Barrett, do you want to?
I would piggyback on that. I don't know if it necessarily like encouraged or discouraged. I don't know if those are really the right word, but it certainly sets you up for, you know, seeing what else is out there. So I think co-op was absolutely invaluable. As good as any architecture program is, like, you're never prepared for what an office is like. Like, you can't teach what it's like to be in an architecture environment with deadlines and coworkers and ongoing projects and et cetera. So being in co-op is really, I mean, that was something that kept me in the field personally. It certainly didn't discourage me from leaving. And I know that is something that happens. People go to co-op and they're like, oh my God, this is so different than architecture school. I don't want to be here, which is fine. You know, but I'm thankful to have found that out like sophomore year and not after I graduated with 5-6 years under my belt. That's for sure. So I would say like the co-op program specifically encouraged me to stay in the field, whether that was lighting or architecture. I think it's all kind of still under the same umbrella and the same environment. But, you know, I found that I enjoyed being in the office environment and in that kind of high pressure workflow that is architecture and design.
That's great. And I mean, Nawaz, do you think did it expose you enough to all the different aspects of architecture? Did you hear about other things you could do besides being, a licensed architect? And, if not, where did you find that information?
Yeah, I mean, I think it at least helps set up the foundation for that. And as I mentioned before, I think definitely the creative process is like the foundation to all the stuff in the whole design world. At least that's my point of view. And so like even the value that I could bring today to my teammates is really just taking super ambiguous, messy problems and trying to help the team work towards a more clear solution. And that's like an oversimplification of a design process, but that foundation is super critical. And I think that definitely helps set up for like any other problem, whether that's digital or architecture or other types of design. Having that process be super kind of baked in, the rigorous studios and all that kind of stuff, like that's still something I tap into today. And that's definitely been the support that I've kind of leveraged to keep driving forward.
So Amy, I'll go to you next. While you were sort of taking risks, to pursue this alternate career path, what obstacles along the way did you find and how did you overcome them?
Yeah, great question. So I kind of decided I wanted to be sustainability consultant when I was in grad school, focusing on environmental design and building science. But similar to Barrett, I actually graduated with my MArch in 2011 as well. And the firm that I wanted to work for whom I work now, wasn't hiring at that time. They had just opened the San Francisco office. They were trying to grow during a recession and they didn't hire new employees for 4 or 5 years. So I had to pivot. And so I was lucky enough to get a job within an architecture firm who did prioritize sustainability, but they didn't really have any kind of established sustainability process or analysis or tools like that in-house. And so I, while working within the kind of traditional architecture process and working as part of a team on projects as a kind of somewhat junior designer, I was also kind of trying to establish a sustainability process in-house there. And so it was really good experience for me in terms of interacting with architects. So I was kind of like an in-house consultant and I had to kind of pitch my services to other project managers because it wasn't a requirement. And I was just trying to get everybody to do more sustainable projects and trying to help guide them with that. While also working on my own architecture project. I still had deadlines. I still was part of a team. I still had responsibilities. And so that set me up really well to do what I do now, which is an external sustainability consultant. So people hire me to come in and my firm to come in and help them along, throughout the architecture design process to make their projects more sustainable. And so I had to wait, for 4.5 years until an opening in the field that I wanted with the firm that I wanted was available, and just kind of do the best that I could with what was available at the time. And I think it was a great stepping stone for me.
Great. Thank you. Ernst, what do you think? Obstacles along the way that?
I mean, it's a very good question, actually. So when I graduated, it was literally at the hit of the recession.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that obstacles in regards to even if I wanted to get into architecture, it would have been a significantly harder process for me to get into anyways. I had so many friends that were graduating and could not find jobs because it is definitely more of a client service provider, as opposed to in real estate development. If you're a principal, that is, there are more opportunities for you to at least manage existing assets, even if, or reach out to acquiring assets to help their portfolio. So I think that the obstacles are a difficult thing for me because I was already going down that path of real estate development anyways. So I won't say that it was easy coming out in 2008 and finding a job, but I will say that what architecture did do was provide, a unique resume to put on the table, because I think at that point in time, there were probably more of the civil engineers and others that were applying for these jobs. So having the architecture background actually helped to make me more appealing in that realm. So I would say that, that's how, in terms of using the architecture program, we've overcome obstacles. But I think 2008 had its own list of other things going on as I came out. So
good point. Nawaz, do you want to comment on any
Yeah, I mean,
obstacles? Yeah.
I think for me, given that I was kind of really stepping outside of architecture, even though still within the creative field, it was definitely, at least as I perceived it for myself, a risk that I was taking to stretch outside of it. It wasn't even tangentially connected to architecture. And so just the kind of risk of the like unknown unknowns there, those were definitely top of mind. But I think over time, for me, it was really just around building credibility that I could leverage what I had learned through architecture as also just another differentiated kind of skill set that other traditional UX designers couldn't provide. And just building up credibility with, things like side projects and just, online learning is like a huge tool nowadays. And so just kind of building that credibility up over time and essentially trying to just de-risk my own risk in kind of stepping outside of architecture. And I think similarly to, as everyone mentioned, like it was also, I graduated in 2010 with my MArch, and again, within the recession, I was practicing for 5 years, but it was still kind of the same looming question around like, does the business of architecture make sense for me in the long run? And then, what is the next step there? And that was kind of a pivotal moment.
Right. And Barrett, do you want to comment as well? I don't want to leave you out. Any obstacles?
Second, I mean, yeah, as I mentioned, it was the first obstacle was trying to get a job.
Right.
When I graduated, I believe I applied to 25 firms and heard back from 2 regarding actual interviews. So there were slim pickings, which, drove me into what I do. So whether, it's something to keep in mind is even if there are obstacles, don't let them get you down, because they certainly can kind of push you in a different direction, which isn't the worst thing. Everything kind of happens for a reason. So those obstacles that you face may seem terrible at the time, but jumping into something else or trying something else, and just like Noah said, is like leveraging that knowledge and kind of shifting it and kind of making yourself stand out amongst the others when you're trying to get into any sort of field is certainly something. Architecture is impressive on a resume. It does give you a lot of knowledge, so just use that. Good to have.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So I guess when you take a step back, now that you're in your sort of non-traditional careers, has your perspective changed on the architecture field today? I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that. Currents, you look like you having another aha moment over there.
No, these are some good questions.
Yes.
So, no, for me.
Okay.
Only because how I viewed architecture, and I'm not saying it was correct, but how I viewed architecture when I was there was very much so a design-focused aesthetic component, right? It's not that, right? If you get into architecture, if you go to a firm, they have structural teams on board. They have engineering teams on board. They have all these other components to it. But I will say, when you look at the whole overall development process to things, architecture does provide that direction and guidance still for all the other subs and consultants to really come to with a comprehensive design. So I will say though that, architecture still, at least in how I envisioned it when I was at Northeastern, in terms of, really drafting the plan, no pun intended, but, putting that together is still kind of the footprint that happens now. You just start to realize when you get into the development field that there's a lot more input that happens even before the design phase starts. And it's not so much focused on just your creative guys while you're in the room. It's more, there are a list of parameters that get set out in front. So just more detail around it. But I think the overall concept of what I viewed architecture at, and again, not saying that it was right, but how I viewed architecture and how it's implemented has not changed at all, actually.
Okay.
I would agree with that. I mean, I came out of architecture school thinking it was like, well, not even, I guess going into architecture school thinking it was, a lot of that aesthetic and big design planning, but there's so many little details you have to address. And having become a lighting designer, I basically have become an expert in one small thing. So I know a lot about a little thing versus architecture, which has to know a little bit about everything. So it's 2 different paths, and both are completely valid, but it's just figuring out kind of what you want to do. Like if, you want to be in lighting and focus on that one layer on the drawing, there are so many other layers on the drawing. Like you mentioned, there's structural, there's mechanical, there's lighting, there's architecture, there's all those things, there's development, there's client relationships. So just deciding whether you kind of want to be the big picture person in the architecture role, or you want to be an expert in one thing and kind of drive your focus on that. So
yeah, Barrett,
I didn't realize there was that many layers either.
Yeah, you took the words out of my mouth. I was going to say the exact same thing about, you know, either being a specialist in one area or being the architect who is kind of the shepherd of the entire vision. And I think to add to that, I do have more of an appreciation having worked with a lot of different architects as a specialist, and I'm sure you probably have a similar experience, that there are a lot of different ways of engaging and interacting with the specialists that you hire as an architect to work on your project. And I think, yeah, I just have more of an appreciation for those architects who are good at communication, who are good at kind of taking the information that is given to them by their specialists or their consultants and integrating it into the design. And, you know, not everyone is as good at that, and kind of listening and taking in that information and trusting the people that are working on the project with you, I think is a huge part. And I think the other thing, a big takeaway for me from going to architecture school and working in architecture is just communication, both kind of within your team, but taking a lot of very detailed information from a lot of your consultants and boiling it down into the key pieces, both verbal and graphic, and presenting it to the client to get the you know, direction, the approval that you want, which we go through a lot of that in architecture school. That's one of the most invaluable skills I think that I took away from school, and just kind of seeing that develop and be such an integral part of the architecture design process from both sides has been really interesting since I left school.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The communication efforts. I mean, every critique you have, as annoying as it may seem, that's a client meeting.
Mm-hmm.
That's a client meeting.
Really good point.
That's what you're going to be doing. You're going to be putting together presentations. You're going to have to defend your work. You're going to have to get up there and speak in front of people and show them, you know, presentable presentations or boards or whatever they may be. But, you know, those critiques, that's what you end up doing, whether it's in front of professors or it's in front of your future clients. It's the same thing. So having that experience before getting into the office was invaluable, as you said.
Yeah, I definitely would just add a third check to that part. You know, whether it's the clients, whether it's the city officials, whether it's to your own board members, the presentation and communication of, you know, just a project in hand is invaluable. And I think that those critiques, if you feel you're getting beat up in those critiques now, just, you know, build a thick skin now, because, you know, it definitely comes on a little later. So right.
Yeah, and I think that's applicable anywhere, right? It's taking a lot of complex information, knowing what it is that your audience cares about, and kind of synthesizing it to be clear and coherent.
Yeah, I'll definitely plus 3 or 4 on that. It is definitely like the muscle that's built up through, you know, going through studio and the crit process and having the final crits and things like that definitely sets you up for this. Because again, it's a synthesis of all this complex information and also having a point of view that you can communicate, right? And so the value that you bring as a designer or whatever kind of contribution you can make to the team, sharing that point of view in a way that is approachable and bringing people into the process is just kind of core and fundamental to the job. And so, you know, there's never a time where it's just like, you know, design hands off stuff and when people build it, like it's a process as a team. And that's across the board, whether you're traditionally building buildings or if you're building a digital app, or I'm sure any other aspects of the job here that like people have talked about. It's really just bringing people into that process. And that's just invaluable that you learn through the school process.
All really.
I think another muscle that was exercised is certainly the time management, and I'm sure you can all agree with that. You know, all the late nights and crunches towards deadlines, like that also happens in real life, and that's something that architecture school, you know, kind of set you up for. It's like I feel like some other professions like may not focus too much on that, but having studio experience alone, like, puts you in a great position to be able to meet those deadlines, because that's another real pressure that happens, is unavoidable in any profession really. But the fact that we get that experience in architecture school and have those deadlines and have those late nights that you really have to kind of practice being okay with,
Absolutely.
That's been something that I still feel like, oh my God, I'm back in the studio, but it happens in the workforce too. So that's good to have that experience.
And
All
Lynn,
good
to your
points.
question about, changing perspective, I think one thing that has actually allowed me to see coming from an outside of architecture point of view is that there's just still so much potential for architects and architecture to kind of lead some of the change that's necessary that we're seeing right now. And just having designers or architects kind of help lead and shepherd people through that is just so valuable. And at least coming from the outside now, I'm seeing that like there's just so much more that should be happening. And it's definitely kind of coming into this field, whether you're a new graduate, like you can actually take that valuable skill set and help drive real meaningful change, even beyond the walls of architecture.
Yeah, very well said. So I think maybe some audience members tuned in just to, think, I wonder if I can, how do I break into these fields? What are the communities like? So I guess I just want to ask you what your sort of culture is like at your workplace, and if there was, say, somebody who wants to break in to this type of work, I mean, who would they have to speak to? What are the connections they have to make? I don't know if anyone wants to start.
I'll chime into that. So I had two
great.
different, very different work experiences. So my first job was at HLB Lighting, which was a lighting design firm, completely third-party consultant, and we worked with architects every day. So we had everywhere from someone who graduated with a degree in economics, myself in architecture. We had interior designers. We had people all over the map that kind of learned the ropes and got into this field. But we worked completely on our own in our own office, and worked completely for architects that hired us. And then I moved over to an AE firm, which was much more integrated. So, I sit in not right now, let's be honest. I sit in the same room with mechanical engineers, structural engineers, marketing, architects. We're all in the same office. So it's been a different experience working for both. But again, we see architecture resumes come across our desk for lighting probably just as frequently as architects see architecture students. So it's just a matter of breaking in. Again, if we were to see an architecture resume and you have, the prowess to put together great presentations, look at conceptual designs, be able to put together precedents, draft, all that is valuable. Whether you know anything about lighting or not, that can be taught. Things can be taught in the job, the kind of in-office experience and kind of that technical prowess, whether it be sustainability or client relations and development or lighting, that can be taught. But having that background of architecture and at least being able to understand and jump right into some of the kind of production work to get your feet wet in any one of these fields is really all it takes. So, if you have any interest, any one of us could be, a resource for how to get into, any one of our professions.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'd just piggyback on that because I think we have similar, our culture is very open. We have architects, engineers, we have someone who was a some system designer for NASA.
Wow.
So, for us, when I'm part of our hiring committee as well. So when we are looking at resumes, we're really just looking for critical thinking skills, communication skills, and a little bit of experience in something to do with the building realm is helpful, but it's not necessary. And then most of our kind of particular work that we do and skills that we need, we teach on the job, as Barrett was saying, just because the way we work is quite particular. And so it's really about being able to work with people because we're working with each other and with architects a lot. And that's a huge part of our job is that communication and critical thinking is the key thing. And so being able to just present yourself and your passion. For us, the biggest thing, as I should have said first, is passion for sustainability. And so if we see that and, we can work with that and build from there. So I think just reaching out and we've done informational interviews, that kind of stuff is really helpful, I think, to both convey your passion and show the interest that you have for a specific firm or specific type of work. Because again, I think in many fields, if we see passion, that's really the key thing, and everything else can build from there.
Yeah, Nawaz, a question came in actually. So speaking of resumes and marketing yourself, but specifically to you, and I think most of you actually could answer this question. When you were searching for, and you in particular, your UX designer job, did you use your architecture portfolio, or did you have to build up a whole new body of work to bring credibility to
Yeah, that's
what
a really
people
great
thought you could
question.
do?
Yeah,
It was a great
absolutely. I
question.
mean, yeah, that's a really great question. And it was kind of a bit of both. So it was really framing architecture projects in kind of a UX process lens, given that those processes are pretty similar. Again, the output is obviously different, but kind of a design process in general is pretty straightforward. And so really showcasing that, as a designer, I was able to take teams through that process. So that was kind of one component. And the other component was actually showing UX type projects. So I was doing kind of some side projects as just for me, just to see if I even enjoyed this work, and then also to kind of build up that skill set. Because again, at the end of the day, like, process is there, but you still have outputs, and so you have to be able to prove that you can deliver on those. And so I kind of had a shift in my portfolio showcasing that I could leverage the years of experience co-op and in the field to kind of showcase design experience, and then more tactical things on the UX front, showing that I could actually do the UX side of things.
Great. What about current? Would you say the same thing, or when you were sort of interviewing for, I guess, the real estate jobs, when you first started, what experience did you have that lent itself to that, or didn't?
I couldn't even tell you where my architecture portfolio has been since 2008. It was not anything that I've ever needed to use for it. But again, what they wanted to see is what use of programs can I use, right?
Yes.
So
Okay.
I use AutoCAD. So they wanted to make sure that, that was a great tool for them, right? I could do SketchUp. I mean, back then it was Form Z. I mean, now it's, Revit and Rhino and all those other programs. So.
We're dating ourselves, you realize?
But,
oh no, Form Z.
I know, I hadn't thought about that in years.
Sends a chill down my spine, right?
Oh God, trust me. When someone brought up crits, I was already starting to have,
flashbacks.
But no, so I've never had to show a portfolio. And I think it's because, again, the realm I'm in, architecture is part of the team. They're not the team, right? So
right.
I think for my perspective, architecture is going to be more about how do I digest and integrate and be able to, receive information coming from the architect as opposed to provide that information. So reading CADs, I can easily go and take takeoffs, do things like that. So employers wanted to see that, and they love seeing that. So that's probably where it went through for me, but a portfolio was not something that I required for any application I've gone through, for sure.
Interesting.
And then specifically for the UX community in general, there's a strong presence in Boston, and obviously like in the Bay Area and all over, and even remotely now. And it's actually, I would say it's one of the most kind of open and helpful group of people, just because given the way that UX has matured and it's a pretty new field, people have come into the field from very different perspectives and backgrounds. And so it's really been a community that kind of like shepherds people through this process of how to actually make it into UX. And so a lot of people, even as I was trying to and considering a pivot into UX, were super helpful. Definitely feel free to reach out. You can always, do a Zoom call now, or, grab coffee when it's safe to do that. But, my story into UX, as I mentioned to you, Lynn, before, was I just ended up going to a UX conference just to see what it was about. And I had a portfolio kind of ready at that point. And I met the hiring manager at Oracle at the conference, and we just talked through my portfolio, and I had talked about, what I was thinking, and he kind of offered me a job on his team. And that was kind of like, okay, like this may be a sign to pivot now. And again, it's really just finding people, and at least in the UX field and the way that we're hiring on our teams, a portfolio is a must. And even if you're reaching out to people, just making sure that that's available, because even when I get that, like, that's the first thing I do is actually look at someone's portfolio, and so that I have some more meaningful conversations and how to take that forward, given that we are also aggressively hiring and filling needs on our teams.
And I'm just trying to remember
earlier.
Oh, sorry, Bart.
Oh, sorry. I think to piggyback earlier on what we were saying about like the presentations and kind of being able to just present yourself. Like Noah said, that's the first thing I look at too. If we get something, I'm like, let me see their portfolio, and whatever the content is, it doesn't really matter. It's like, can you communicate your ideas? And can you, how are your presentation skills? Like, are you able to kind of put all this information together in a coherent and, you know, presentable and aesthetically pleasing way? And that's kind of the first like check mark that we're like, okay, we'll continue to look at this person, because again, whether the content is architectural or anything else, things are learned on the job. So if you can kind of put forward that you have that creative, you know, nod, and then, like Amy said, show some sort of interest, some sort of passion in what we do. You know, even if it's just like, hey, I heard about lighting design, it sounds awesome. You know, I'd love to learn more. I don't know anything yet, but hey, here's my portfolio, and I can, you know, certainly present and draft. You know, that's great right off the bat. So even just like the bare bones of a quote unquote portfolio in regards to that.
Yeah, Lynn, just this is, I think this is a great piece that you're showing now, because it's also showing how the four of us are in different realms. Barrett and Amy are probably in closer realms in terms of the work they're doing, where it shows that, you know, they're absolutely right. And I've heard that from plenty of my peers who are in architecture, but for real estate development, it doesn't apply the same way, right? So it's really more people really paying attention to what do you want to get into and kind of what goes into that. I mean, for us, it's not portfolios, it's what projects have you worked on, right? And if you're just trying to break into the career, clearly you have no projects you've worked on, right? So that's probably more the piece where Jeff Stillman wants to know you have interest, but they're going to want to know you have a background that goes into that. It does not mean it's impossible. I've known one person when I was at Boston Properties that used to be a film producer, right? That is rare, right? That is not, we don't present it more so because that is not the typical, right? But for her purposes, she took courses and went through things to show that she understood what she was going to be digesting when she got into that. And I think that anyone on this panel would I would hope understand and agree, where for all the students here, really just pay attention to the path you're going through, right? Because they don't all have the same requirements, even if they come through with the same basis. And I think that that's really on display here. And I think it's a good thing for them to see.
Yeah, if I could just, like, that's a super great call out, Prince. And even just to kind of use the UX process, like if you're empathetic to the hiring manager that you're kind of trying to get attention of, just put yourself in that mindset of like, what are they looking for? And just make sure you're crafting your story to kind of align to what that is. And that story could be different based on the path that you're looking to kind of go down. But just, again, using that empathy and the design process to actually make that into a project, right? Like, what is that hiring manager at any number of these companies? What are the problems they're trying to solve? And how do you specifically contribute to that solving of the problem?
Yeah, and I think just to close that, or not necessarily close it, but just add to that and refer back to some of the other comments. I think my experience, you know, I was always shy and kind of nervous about like going up and talking to people at conferences or going to a conference to seek people out to ask questions. But now that I'm on the other side of it, everyone in my field, and I'm sure in the other panelists' fields, are actually really friendly and for the most part really excited to talk about what they do. And so don't be shy or don't be afraid. So to Nawaz's point, you know, putting yourself in their shoes and figuring out what they want is really valuable, but don't be afraid to ask them what they want, and to help you build that that experience and that understanding of what happens in a certain field and what a certain field is looking for, A, to figure out if that's what you want to do, or B, to help you kind of cultivate your work to be able to present to either that person or someone else in that field. I think it's, you know, there's no harm in talking and asking questions. And again, I think, you know, people are usually really excited to talk about what they do if they're passionate about it, which, you know, all of us are. And most people who work in our fields are passionate about it as well and want more young, bright minds to work in our fields as well. So we're always really happy to help shepherd people.
I can't believe you were ever shy, Amy, but I'm trying to remember back. You've come a long way if that's the case. Love it. So we actually got a question in. I think it's great. And I think all four of you could speak to this. Are you happy with the amount of impact you have in your job now? And what skills are you working on building at this point? Do you see more pivots in your future? I don't know. Barrett, you want to take that one first?
Sure.
Or?
I'm absolutely happy with the impact I do. So something I mentioned earlier is like going through architecture and not realizing like what other layers there are to a building, you know, whether it's lighting or structural or even development side, like there's all these different layers to it. having moved into being a specialist for one layer, now obviously it's all I notice is lighting. And I'm glad to bring that to the team, because we often work with like interior designers who kind of think they have an idea of lighting, but then we go in and we make significant changes just on past experience and expertise. So knowing that I'm out there kind of improving the lighting environment is exactly what I'm here to do. You know, that's what my job entails. And to be able to know that I'm making a difference in a lot of these projects, I mean, you can have the most beautiful architecture ever, but if it's not illuminated, no one's seeing it or noticing it. So it's something that I find very impactful with every project I work on. I personally am kind of working on building my business development experience and marketing. So while I'm still completely engrossed in the lighting design portion of it, you know, I personally am trying to kind of get more into the business side of things and be a part of the marketing efforts and part of the business development efforts, which are in the bigger picture with architecture. You know, I'm working with the architecture teams and all the other consultant teams to kind of come together and put together proposals and make project plans and whatnot. So that's where kind of my interests are shifting. I wouldn't say it's a pivot at all. I'm still going to continue with lighting design, but kind of just taking that business development side seriously and working towards, you know, being a bigger part of that team.
Thank you. Kurtz, you want to comment on that? I mean,
well, I absolutely love what I do.
you can
I
tell.
love the impact. I love the impact. It's literally, if I go to the financial district, being able to see, you know, the 100 Federal Street atrium, then being able to go to Back Bay Station and see what plans are in place for going through that. I like to be able to walk through the city and, you know, see it's tangible, right? You could see the impact that you put into spaces and office spaces, you know, the feelings you give to your clients as they walk into their new home, right? Because for a lot of us, we spend more time in the office than we do at our actual homes, right? So in terms of the impact, I absolutely love the impact for that for sure. In terms of what skills I'm trying to still do, I think communication in what I do is always going to be something that you're always trying to hone, because as you come to different audiences, you're learning new ways of communicating. But I think probably the most critical thing is information retention. I mean, there's so much information being thrown at you from so many different realms, whether it's the public realm in regards to permitting, whether it's regards to your ownership in budgeting and their fiscal responsibilities, whether it's coming from the architects, there's a ton coming from the design teams, as well as coming from the contractors. There's just so much to retain. I feel like that's a skill that I'm consistently working on. I think everyone, at least in my realm, is consistently working on, because there's a lot to keep the ball rolling, which is really what our job is supposed to be. So,
absolutely.
Yeah, I love my impact as well. So similarly to Barrett, you know, being a specialist on a team, I get to focus on kind of one part of the project, and working for the firm I work for, we get to work with really impactful clients, which is great. So I feel like I have an impact both on kind of the individual human level, but also potentially on the kind of national global level through policy, which feels really great for sustainability especially. But even though I'm a specialist, there are still so many areas of further specialty within sustainability. And so I'm not pivoting. I love what I do, and I don't foresee myself ever not being a sustainability consultant and or a teacher, but I am kind of continuing to hone my kind of skills and knowledge within a couple certain areas. So I'm still a generalist to sustainability, but I'm kind of diving deeper on some issues to become even more of a specialist within the specialist realm I'm already in. And then additionally to Barrett, I'm kind of at the similar timeline of my career where, you know, we're at the point where we're kind of presenting out more frequently and kind of starting to build more business development skills, trying to bring in work, more client engagement, more marketing, kind of presenting at conferences and that kind of stuff. And despite Lynn's comment earlier about not imagining that I was ever shy, this is the area that is kind of the hardest for me to work on from just my personality, and so it's a fun challenge, and I think I've made progress, but it's a kind of continual process to just keep keep developing those communication skills and business development skills.
Excellent. Nawaz, you want to comment on that quickly, or?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely got into UX just because of the impact that I felt that I could have as a designer working within technology. You know, the UX process is definitely very much starting with the user needs. So leveraging research and understanding people's behaviors and the challenges and solving for those. And from a technology perspective, there are more closer, tighter iteration loops. So we can put stuff into the world, see if it works, see if it actually does the thing that we intended it to, and then keep iterating on that and making sure that it's actually making the impact. And specifically for the area that I work in, you know, given that I work within the kind of life sciences, healthcare moonshot, you know, the impact there is really just around the mission for me, you know, trying to help drive better patient outcomes and driving change within healthcare and having design help lead that. You know, just even, for example, the COVID situation, like our teams actually jumped on and start to, you know, stood up products to help people get tested for COVID and stuff like that. So those are kind of opportunities that I'm super passionate about and feel that UX can definitely contribute to. And in terms of just overall growth, definitely, as everyone mentioned, as kind of getting into more seniority roles, like business strategy is definitely one of the key areas. And as I'm thinking about how to position our products and our teams, you know, if people can't get to the products or like actually access them or get them built, then, you know, the design isn't actually even usable. So, you know, that's a clear need, and making sure that, you know, as I can continue my development, having made sure that design is tied to the business strategy.
Thank you so much. So we have a couple of other questions here, so I want to get right to them. So for the panelists who went to grad school, I think that's 3 of you, correct? I think I have that right. Was your career pivot in sight when you committed to grad school? What was your thought process regarding whether, when, where to apply? Actually targeted Amy, especially Amy who went to AA instead of NU. Could you reflect a little bit on that process?
Yeah, so for me, my selection in grad school was definitely with my career pivot in sight. I don't think I knew at the time that I was going to completely pivot to consulting and versus sustainability within architecture, but I chose to go to the AA instead of NU because I wanted to focus on building physics. And at the time, there weren't actually very many sustainability programs. The AA was one of the few. Now there are lots to choose from, which is great. And so, yes, for me, it was probably the critical deciding factor. I did work a little bit before. I took a little bit of time in between undergrad and grad. So I did take a little bit of time to kind of fully make that decision. But I think that's maybe one piece of advice, is that it can be really easy to just kind of continue in the schooling process, whether it's at NU or not at NU, just go from undergrad to grad and kind of keep going through. But I think, you know, the grad school option is always there, and it's really valuable to take a little bit of time to work or travel or do something else to kind of really figure out what you want out of grad school before committing to it, because I think that can help you select a program that can at least potentially set you up for a pivot or a specialty within architecture, or help you just figure out what your general path might be.
What do you think, Barrett?
Yeah, so as much as I would like to agree with Amy that was my career path was forced by the economy. So when I graduated in 2010, there again weren't a lot of jobs, and I got that old double Husky discount, which I took advantage of, and right, hands up for that one. So I decided to stay and kind of hold out another year to see if the job market would improve. At the time, I definitely continued to think that I wanted to be an architect, and in order to become a licensed architect, I had to go to grad school. So the appeal of just the single year of additional grad school was also something that definitely kept me at Northeastern, which I don't regret for a bit. I got both my undergrad and graduate there, and came out with a master's. So any day now, I guess I could, in theory, take the architecture exams, but I don't plan on it at this point. But I will say that it was not planned, my transition into lighting. But things happened afterwards, and here I am. So
good. Nawaz, you want to speak to grad school really quickly?
Yeah, I'll definitely +1 the double Husky discount, and the 5+1 was very appealing at the time. And again, at the time, UX was also not a kind of a more mature field. I wasn't actually even aware of what UX was back then. And so there wasn't really a master's program nearby that I was kind of looking into in terms of interaction designer UX. That definitely exists now. And so thinking back, like if I was in the same situation, I probably would have maybe taken some time off and try to work and then go back into a master's program there. But I'm super appreciative and happy that I actually ended up completing the Masters of Architecture program. And the kind of same to Barry, it's like I could always go back into architecture and get licensed if I wanted to. And just that was also another thing that I just wanted to make sure that option was available, given that I was making this pivot.
Great.
Great.
We had a question come in, and Currents, you might be a good person to answer this. Someone's asking, how often do you change firms? What are some benefits of doing so? What are the advantages of maybe staying at the same office for a long time? And we could just insert, not so much firm for you, but a company. It seems like you've moved around a little bit, and is that a good thing, bad thing?
I've not stayed anywhere less than 5 years.
Okay, so that's a good amount of time.
I think for me, I wouldn't say that moving around is a big thing in my industry. I think it depends though, right? If you're on the construction side, if you're on, some of the specialty, we see them move around all the time, right? For, development, they typically want to invest in people who are there to help work with them on building that portfolio. And most of the projects that we take on are taking on about a 2 to 3 year period anyways. So leaving frequently in what I do is not something that's there. It may look like that's the case, but I think that's more aging me than anything else. But I think working,
yes.
I've not worked anywhere less than, I think my first job out of school, I worked there for 6 years, just left BP as of March of this year. So I think and that was about 5 years there. So I would not say that it's something where changing firms consistently is the way to go.
Okay.
I can't say it will hurt you. It just depends that, I think typically people try to stay put where they are because you're there to really invest in that company and building out that portfolio.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, I would second that as well. Similar timelines. Obviously, building projects are multi-year timelines, and given that our field is a specialty field and we do a lot of on-the-job training, if we see someone who's moving around, frequently, I would say less than a couple years, it's a red flag for us because it's a big financial and time investment for us to train up people. And I think a little bit of moving around early in your career. Sorry,
at least you have a nice backdrop. That's true.
Avery.
Or actually, no.
I have a little background noise there.
Sorry, yeah. So a little bit of moving around early in your career, every few years isn't really alarming. That's kind of part of the process. But I think especially later on, I would agree with like the kind of 5 year timeline. But at the same time, I think it is important to be honest with yourself about kind of the limitations. If you find yourself being limited in a role that you're in, or in a firm that you're in, or a company that you're in, looking for something different that can leverage your skills and your passion. I think your new future employer would appreciate that as well. So it's a little bit of a dance between finding the right amount of time to invest somewhere to determine whether it is really for you versus moving around all the time.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just add also just kind of thinking about, junior roles and maybe more senior roles. Like I think within junior roles, it may be advantageous to move around a little bit and kind of try to find your niche or area of focus or specialty. And that's something definitely that I did. And that's just in the architecture realm. And I think specifically in the UX and tech world, like people do move around a lot. I mean, people staying more than 2.5 years is kind of a, if you see that on a resume, it's kind of eye-opening if you see that. But I think as you move into more senior roles, people do stick around. And, typically if we're seeing career growth, even if you're staying for 5 years, like that's the thing you're looking for. If we're seeing people staying for 5 years and there isn't growth in roles and things like that, like that's a huge red flag.
I think it's really interesting to look also at like architecture versus like the consultant side. Like I know, you know, architects in Boston, there are a ton of them. There are a ton of architecture firms, there are a ton of architecture schools, and there's, you know, a lot of people coming out of them. And then you look at the specialties, like, you know, what Amy does with sustainability and what I do with lighting is like a much smaller, like niche market. So moving around is not nearly as common. I mean, I could name probably every single lighting designer in Boston. So everybody knows everyone, and it's a small network. So moving around certainly is not, you know, I was at my first shop for 6 years, and I'm coming up on like just over 3 at this one, and don't plan on leaving anytime soon. So it definitely just depends on kind of which market you're in. You know, Noah said the UX, you know, moves around a lot, and every profession is different. But I do find that, you know, consultants seem to move around less than do architects. Architects seem like a pretty transient field. People are moving around a lot more than, you know, when you get into a specialty and then are becoming an expert on it.
In the interest of, I guess we probably need to end. We should probably do a hard stop here for anyone that needs to leave. I suppose if you want to stay on and our panelists are open for a few more minutes, we could get a few more questions in, but I do want to be appreciative of people's time. So thank you so much for tuning in to our panel. This was excellent to hear some of the alumni, and it's always good to bring these panels together and get some expert advice from people that have been there in your shoes and now have really gone on to do some successful careers, and it's great to see. So thank you so much. And if I'm hoping that if anybody who logged on today wants to reach out to any of you I could share your emails and